The desert sun beat down mercilessly on Jake's weathered face as he guided his horse along the rocky trail. He had been riding for 3 days straight, heading toward the town of Silver Creek where he hoped to find work at the copper mine. The year was 1882, and opportunities were scarce for a man like him. No family, no land, just the clothes on his back and a stubborn will to survive. As his horse picked its way carefully around a bend in the canyon, Jake heard something that made him pull up short. It was a soft whimper, barely audible above the wind whistling through the rocks. He dismounted and followed the sound, his boots crunching on the gravelly ground. Behind a cluster of barrel cacti he found her. A young Apache woman, maybe 18 or 19 years old, lay crumpled against a boulder. Blood seeped from a gunshot wound in her shoulder, staining her buckskin dress dark red. Her long black hair was matted with sweat and dust, and her breathing came in shallow gasps. She was unconscious, her bronze skin pale from blood loss. Jake's first instinct was to look around nervously. Relations between whites and Apaches in this territory were deadly serious. Just last month he'd heard about a cavalry patrol that had been ambushed not 20 miles from here. But looking at the girl's face, peaceful despite her pain, he couldn't bring himself to ride away. He knelt beside her and gently shook her shoulder. Her dark eyes fluttered open, immediately alert despite her weakness. When she saw his face, she tried to scramble backward, but the movement sent a fresh wave of blood flowing from her wound. She said something in Apache, her voice urgent and fearful. Jake raised his hand slowly, showing he meant no harm. "Easy there," he said softly. "I'm not going to hurt you. You're bleeding pretty bad." He pointed to her shoulder, then to his water canteen. "Water," he said, miming drinking. "You need water." The girl stared at him with intelligent dark eyes, clearly trying to decide whether to trust him. Her lips were cracked and dry, and Jake could see she was severely dehydrated. The desert was unforgiving, and without water she would die within hours. Moving slowly so as not to startle her, Jake uncapped his canteen and offered it to her. She hesitated for a long moment, then reached out with a trembling hand. He helped her sit up against the boulder, supporting her back with his arm. She drank deeply, water running down her chin as she gulped it greedily. "Slow down," Jake murmured, though he doubted she understood English. "You'll make yourself sick." After she had drunk her fill, he wet his bandana with the remaining water and gently cleaned the blood from around her wound. The bullet had gone clean through her shoulder, painful but not fatal if treated properly. As he worked, the girl watched him with curious eyes. She seemed surprised by his gentleness, as if she had expected cruelty from a white man. When he finished bandaging her shoulder with strips torn from his spare shirt, she spoke again in Apache, her voice softer now. Jake wished he could understand her words, but her tone seemed grateful. He helped her to her feet, noting how she swayed unsteadily. She was in no condition to travel alone, but he couldn't leave her here to die. "Where's your people?" he asked, gesturing around the desert. She pointed northeast toward a range of distant mountains. It was at least 2 days' ride, maybe more for someone injured. Jake made a decision that would change his life forever. He helped the girl onto his horse, then climbed up behind her. She tensed at first, clearly uncomfortable with the closeness, but she was too weak to protest. As they rode toward the mountains, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was riding into something much bigger than a simple act of mercy. The girl spoke little during their journey, but Jake noticed her watching him carefully, as if studying his character. When they stopped to rest, she would murmur something in Apache that sounded almost like a chant or prayer. He began to wonder if saving her life meant more to her people than he realized. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of orange and red, they made camp in a sheltered canyon. The girl seemed stronger after drinking more water and eating some of Jake's dried beef. She spoke his name questioningly, pointing to herself and saying Ayana, which he took to be her name. That night, as Jake kept watch by their small fire, he noticed Ayana staring at him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. There was something in her eyes, not just gratitude, but something deeper, more significant. She spoke quietly in Apache, gesturing between them, but he couldn't understand the words. Jake had no way of knowing that by offering water to a dying Apache woman, he had just performed one of the most sacred acts in her culture, the gift of life itself. Among Ayana's people, such an act created bonds deeper than blood, obligations that lasted lifetimes. As she watched him sleep under the desert stars, Ayana knew her fate was now tied to this strange white man who had shown her unexpected kindness. Tomorrow, they would reach her village and everything would change. The Apache village came into view just as the morning sun crested the mountain peaks. Jake felt his stomach tighten as he saw the cluster of wickiups and lean-tos scattered along the canyon floor. Smoke rose from cooking fires and he could see figures moving about their daily tasks. His heart pounded as he realized he was about to ride into the heart of Apache territory, something few white men had done and lived to tell about. Ayana stirred in front of him, having dozed fitfully during the night's ride. When she saw her home, she spoke excitedly in Apache, pointing ahead. But Jake noticed something else in her voice, nervousness, maybe even worry. She kept glancing back at him, as if uncertain about what was going to happen next. The first to spot them was a young boy tending goats on the hillside. His shout echoed through the canyon, and within moments people were emerging from their shelters. Jake could see the shock on their faces, their missing daughter returning with a white stranger. As they rode into the village, a crowd gathered around them. Jake had never felt so out of place in his life. Weathered warriors with fierce eyes studied him with obvious suspicion. Women clutched their children close, whispering among themselves. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. An older man with gray streaking his long black hair stepped forward. His bearing and the deference others showed him marked him as someone important, probably the chief. He spoke sharply to Ayana in Apache, his tone demanding answers. She slid down from the horse and immediately began speaking rapidly, gesturing to her bandaged shoulder and then to Jake. Jake dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. He had left his rifle tied to the saddle, not wanting to appear threatening, but he wished now he felt less defenseless. The chief's dark eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made him want to squirm. Then Ayana did something that surprised everyone, including Jake. She walked over to him and took his hand, speaking earnestly to her people in Apache. The crowd murmured, some sounding pleased, others clearly upset. The chief's eyebrows rose and he looked between Ayana and Jake with new interest. An elderly woman stepped forward. Ayana's grandmother, Jake guessed from the girl's obvious affection for her. The old woman examined Ayana's wound carefully, asking questions in a gentle voice. Ayana's responses seemed to satisfy her and she nodded approvingly at Jake. But not everyone was pleased. A young warrior with a scarred face and hostile eyes pushed through the crowd. He spoke angrily to Ayana, pointing accusingly at Jake. Even without understanding the language, Jake could tell the man was upset about Ayana being with a white man. Ayana's response was firm and clear. She stood straighter despite her injury and spoke with conviction that brooked no argument. The scarred warrior's face darkened, but he stepped back, clearly outranked by whatever authority Ayana had claimed. The chief raised his hand for silence. When the crowd quieted, he spoke to Jake directly in heavily accented English. "I am Chief Nalnish. My granddaughter tells me you saved her life. Why did you not leave her to die as most of your people would?" Jake was surprised the chief spoke English, but he answered honestly. "Couldn't just ride away from someone who needed help. Wasn't raised that way." Chief Nalnish studied him for a long moment. "She says you gave her water when she was dying. You cleaned her wounds. You brought her home safely." He paused, exchanging glances with the elderly woman. "Do you understand what this means among my people?" Jake shook his head. "No, sir, I don't. I just did what seemed right." A murmur went through the crowd. Ayana stepped closer to Jake and spoke to her grandfather in Apache. The chief listened, then turned back to Jake with an expression that was hard to read. Among the Apache, the gift of water to one who is dying creates sacred bonds. The chief explained. "You have performed the ritual of life-giving. By our laws and customs, you have claimed responsibility for my granddaughter's life, and by accepting your water, she has accepted you as her protector." Jake felt the blood drain from his face. "I don't understand. I just helped someone who was hurt." The elderly woman spoke to the chief in Apache, gesturing between Jake and Ayana. The chief nodded gravely. "My mother says the spirits guided you to Ayana. She believes this is not chance but destiny." "What does that mean exactly?" Jake asked, though he was beginning to suspect he wouldn't like the answer. Ayana looked up at him, her dark eyes serious. To his surprise, she spoke in halting English. "It means, by law of my people, you are now my husband, and I am your wife." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Around them, the crowd watched his reaction with interest. Some looked pleased, others skeptical, a few openly hostile. The scarred warrior looked furious. "Now hold on," Jake said, panic creeping into his voice. "I never agreed to marry anyone. I just gave the girl some water." Chief Nalnish's expression remained stern. "You performed the ritual whether you understood it or not. Among my people, ignorance does not undo sacred bonds. The water ritual is binding." Jake looked around at the faces surrounding him, realizing he was trapped in something he didn't understand. Ayanna took his hand again, speaking softly in English. "I know you did not mean to marry me, but my people will not let you leave now. The bond is made. We must honor it, or there will be trouble for both of us." The weight of the situation settled on Jake's shoulders like a stone. He had ridden into the desert a free man, and now found himself bound by laws and customs he had never heard of to a woman he barely knew. As he looked into Ayanna's eyes, he wondered if his act of mercy had just cost him his freedom forever. The sun was directly overhead when Chief Nalnish finally dismissed the crowd, but not before Jake noticed the mix of emotions on their faces. Some looked curious about this strange white man who had become part of their tribe through ancient law. Others, especially the younger warriors, seemed resentful and suspicious. The scarred warrior who had spoken angrily earlier kept shooting hostile glances in Jake's direction before finally stalking away. Ayanna's grandmother, who Jake learned was called Grandmother Desba, approached them with a gentle smile. She spoke to Ayanna in rapid Apache, then surprised Jake by addressing him in broken English. "You good man. Ayanna, tell me. You gentle with hurt one. This is good sign." She led them to a large wiki up at the center of the village. Jake hesitated at the entrance, suddenly aware that entering might be seen as accepting his new status. Ayanna noticed his reluctance and touched his arm gently. "Please," she said in her careful English, "is my home now. Must be yours too. People watching. If you refuse, we'll bring shame on my family." Jake realized he had little choice. Inside, the dwelling was larger than it appeared from outside, with woven mats covering the ground and parfleche bags hanging from the supports. The space was divided into areas for sleeping, cooking, and storage. Everything was neat and organized, speaking of a life very different from his own wandering existence. Grandmother Desba bustled about, preparing food while chattering in Apache to Ayanna. The girl translated some of it for Jake. "She says you must be hungry. Apache hospitality requires she feed you well." Ayanna paused, then added quietly, "She also says you look like you need fattening up." Despite everything, Jake almost smiled. "Tell her I appreciate her kindness, and I could probably use some fattening up." As they ate, a stew of rabbit, corn, and wild onions that was surprisingly delicious, Jake tried to process his situation. Chief Nalnish had explained that among the Apache, the water ritual was one of their most sacred traditions. When someone was dying of thirst, offering water created spiritual bonds that transcended tribal boundaries. The person who received the water became bound to their savior, and the savior became responsible for their welfare. "How often does this happen?" Jake asked Ayanna as they finished their meal. She considered the question carefully. "Not often. Usually only Apache give water to dying Apache. Sometimes to other tribes we are friends with. Never to white man before." She looked at him seriously. "You are first." "Lucky me," Jake muttered, then immediately regretted the sarcasm when he saw hurt flash across her face. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean that the way it sounded. This is just a lot to understand." Ayanna nodded. "For me too. I never thought I would have white husband. But grandfather says spirits work in mysterious ways. Maybe this is meant to be." Before Jake could respond, voices outside the wiki-up grew loud and argumentative. Ayanna tensed, listening intently. Her face grew troubled as she translated. "Some of the warriors are upset. They say it is wrong for Apache woman to be bound to white man. They want to challenge the law." Chief Nalnish's voice rose above the others, speaking with clear authority. Gradually the arguments died down, but Jake could sense the tension hadn't disappeared, just been pushed below the surface. "What happens if they decide they don't want to honor this? Marriage?" Jake asked. Ayanna was quiet for a long moment. "If tribal council decides ritual was not performed correctly, you will be asked to leave. But I will be shamed. No Apache man will want me then, because I have been bound to white man. I would become outcast." The weight of responsibility settled heavier on Jake's shoulders. It wasn't just his own freedom at stake anymore, but this young woman's entire future. And if they do accept it, then you become member of tribe. You learn our ways, follow our customs, live as Apache. She looked at him uncertainly. Can you do this? Give up your old life. Jake thought about his old life, drifting from job to job, sleeping under the stars with no one to care if he lived or died, no real purpose beyond survival. It wasn't much to give up, but the idea of completely changing who he was seemed impossible. I don't know, he answered honestly. I don't know anything about being Apache. I teach you, Ayanna said simply. It is my duty now, just as it is your duty to protect and provide for me. That evening, Chief Nelnish came to speak with them privately. His weathered face was grave as he sat cross-legged on a woven mat. I have spoken with the council elders, he said. There is much disagreement about your situation. Some believe the spirits brought you to save Ayanna for a purpose. Others think it is wrong to bind our people to whites who have brought us so much suffering. Jake leaned forward. What do you think, Chief? The old man studied him carefully. I think you are not like other white men I have known. You show respect. You saved my granddaughter when you could have left her to die. These are good signs. He paused. But good intentions are not enough. If you stay among us, you must prove you can truly become one of us. There will be tests. What kind of tests? You must learn our language, our customs, our way of seeing the world. You must show you can hunt and fight alongside our warriors. Most importantly, you must show that you care for Ayanna not as white man takes Apache woman, but as Apache husband cares for Apache wife. Jake glanced at Ayanna, who was listening intently. And if I fail these tests? Chief Nelnish's expression didn't change. Then you will leave, and Ayanna will face the consequences of being bound to one who was not worthy. The threat was clear. Failure would destroy not just Jake's chance at a new life, but Ayanna's place in her own tribe. How long do I have? Jake asked. The next full moon brings the feast of changing seasons. That is when the council will make their final decision. The chief stood to leave, then paused at the entrance. Choose wisely, white man. The path you take now will determine not just your fate, but the fate of my granddaughter as well. After he left, Jake and Ayanna sat in heavy silence. Finally, she spoke softly. You can still try to leave. I would understand. This is not your fault. Jake looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. She was beautiful, but it was more than that. There was intelligence in her dark eyes, strength in the way she held herself despite her injury, and kindness in the way she worried more about his situation than her own. No, he said finally. I won't run away and leave you to face this alone. If I'm going to be Apache, then I better start learning how. The first lesson came at dawn the next morning, when Ayanna shook Jake awake before the sun had even shown its face over the mountains. Apache Day starts early, she whispered. Must greet the sun with prayers and gratitude. Jake stumbled outside to find many of the villagers already awake, standing facing east with their arms raised. Ayanna guided him through the morning ritual, teaching him the words in Apache. His pronunciation was terrible, making some of the children giggle, but the adults nodded approvingly at his effort. After the morning prayers, Ayanna's uncle Nayati approached them. He was a lean, serious man with hawk-like features and scars on his arms that spoke of many battles. Unlike some of the other warriors, he didn't seem hostile, just curious. So you want to learn Apache ways, he said in good English. We will see if white man can become real warrior. He handed Jake a bow made of mulberry wood. First lesson, hunt like Apache. What followed was the most humbling experience of Jake's life. He had always considered himself a decent shot with a rifle, but the Apache bow was completely different. His first arrow sailed wide of the target by several feet, embedding itself in a tree. His second attempt wasn't much better. The younger warriors watching began to snicker among themselves. The scarred warrior who had been hostile the day before, Ayanna told him his name was Goyatle, made loud comments in Apache that made the others laugh harder. What's he saying? Jake asked through gritted teeth as he retrieved another arrow. Ayanna looked embarrassed. He says you shoot like blind old woman, and that maybe white man should stick to things he knows, like stealing Apache land. Jake felt his temper flare, but before he could respond, Nayati placed a firm hand on his shoulder. Do not let anger guide your bow, he said calmly. Apache warrior must have patience, watch. He demonstrated the proper stance, the way to draw the bowstring, how to sight along the arrow. Jake tried again, forcing himself to concentrate despite the mocking laughter. This time the arrow hit the edge of the target. Better, Nayati nodded. But Apache learn by doing, not just watching. You will practice every day until your arrows fly true. The days that followed blended together in an exhausting routine of lessons. Mornings were spent learning to hunt and track with Nayati and some of the other warriors. Jake learned to read sign in the desert, the faint scratch marks that showed which way a deer had passed, the disturbed pebbles that revealed where someone had walked, the subtle changes in vegetation that indicated water nearby. Afternoons were devoted to learning the Apache language with Ayana and grandmother Desba. The old woman was a patient teacher, but the language was unlike anything Jake had ever heard. The tonal variations and complex grammar made his head spin. Apache words have power, grandmother Desba explained one afternoon as they sat outside her wiki-up. When you speak our language, you speak with voice of our ancestors. You must learn not just words, but the spirit behind them. Evenings were spent learning Apache customs and stories around the communal fire. Jake discovered that the Apache had rich traditions passed down through generations, stories of creation, of heroes and tricksters, of the sacred relationship between humans and the natural world. Chief Nalnish often led these sessions, his deep voice weaving tales that captured Jake's imagination. One evening, he told the story of Child of the Water, a great hero who rid the world of monsters and made it safe for human beings. Every Apache man must be like Child of the Water, the chief concluded, looking directly at Jake. Strong enough to protect his people, wise enough to know when not to fight, and brave enough to face any danger for those he loves. Jake was beginning to understand that becoming Apache wasn't just about learning skills or language, it was about adopting an entirely different way of seeing the world. The Apache saw themselves as part of nature, not separate from it. Every action had spiritual significance, every decision affected not just the individual but the entire tribe. But the learning wasn't without its challenges. Goyathle and several other warriors continued to make it clear they didn't approve of Jake's presence. They would accidentally bump into him during training, make cutting remarks in Apache that weren't translated, and generally do everything they could to make him feel unwelcome. The situation came to a head during a hunting expedition 2 weeks after Jake's arrival. He had finally become reasonably proficient with the bow and was tracking a deer through the canyon when he realized he had become separated from the hunting party. As he tried to find his way back, he heard voices ahead. Moving quietly through the brush, he came upon Goyathle and 2 other warriors talking in low, urgent voices. His Apache was still limited, but he caught enough words to understand they were discussing him, and none of it was good. From what he could make out, they were planning to arrange an accident during the hunt, something that would eliminate the white intruder without technically violating the sacred bond. Jake's blood ran cold as he realized how serious the opposition to his presence really was. He managed to slip away without being detected and eventually found his way back to the main hunting party. But the knowledge that some of the warriors wanted him dead weighed heavily on his mind. That evening, he told Ayana what he had overheard. Her face went pale with worry. Goyathle has always been hot-headed, she said. He lost his brother in fight with cavalry soldiers 2 summers ago. He hates all white men. Maybe I should leave before someone gets hurt, Jake suggested. No. Ayana's response was immediate and fierce. If you leave now, it will prove to everyone that white men cannot be trusted to honor Apache law. It will make things worse for any Apache who tries to live in peace with whites. Jake realized she was right. His situation had become about more than just the 2 of them. It was about whether 2 very different cultures could ever truly come together. Then what do we do about Goyathle? He asked. Ayana was quiet for a long moment. There is old Apache way to settle such disputes. Challenge combat. If Goyathle thinks you are not worthy to be Apache, he can challenge you to prove it. Jake felt his stomach drop. He had seen Goyathle in training. The man was a formidable warrior with years of experience in desert fighting. Jake was still learning to use an Apache bow properly. And if he kills me? Then Apache law says he was right to challenge bond. You will be buried with honor, but I will be free of marriage obligation. She looked at him with worried eyes. But if you defeat him, no one can question your right to be here. Jake stared into the fire, knowing his time for learning was running out faster than he had hoped. Soon he would have to prove himself not just as a student of Apache ways, but as a warrior worthy of the name. The challenge came sooner than Jake expected. 3 days later, during the morning meal, Goyatle strode into the center of the village and called out in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Jake didn't need a translation to understand the warrior's intent. The man's hostile posture and the way everyone suddenly fell silent said everything. Ayana's face went ashen. "He calls you out," she whispered. "Says white man who cannot even shoot straight has no right to claim Apache wife. He demands trial by combat to prove who is worthy." Chief Nalnish emerged from his wickiup, his expression grave. He spoke to Goyathle in sharp tones, clearly trying to dissuade him, but the scarred warrior was adamant. Finally, the chief turned to Jake. "Goyathle challenges your right to remain among us," he said formally. "By Apache law, you can accept or decline. But if you decline, you must leave immediately and never return." Jake looked around at the faces surrounding him. Some showed sympathy, others curiosity, but many displayed the same skepticism he had seen since arriving. Even those who had been kind to him seemed to think this moment was inevitable. "What are the terms?" Jake asked, standing slowly. Chief Nalnish glanced at Goyathle, who spoke rapidly in Apache. "Traditional combat," the chief translated. "Bow and knife only. First to yield or fall loses. Combat continues until one cannot continue." Jake felt his mouth go dry. This wasn't going to be a friendly sparring match. Goyathle intended to settle the matter permanently. But backing down now would prove everything the warrior had said about him. "I accept," Jake said, his voice steadier than he felt. The village buzzed with excitement as word spread. By noon, the entire community had gathered in a natural amphitheater formed by the canyon walls. Someone had marked out a fighting circle with stones, and Jake noticed that Goyathle's supporters far outnumbered his own. Nayati approached Jake as he prepared for the combat. "You are brave but foolish," he said quietly. "Goyathle has counted coup on many enemies. He is skilled and angry. This combination is dangerous. Any advice?" Jake asked, checking his borrowed bow for the 10th time. "Fight like Apache, not like white man," Nayati replied. "Apache warrior uses brain more than muscle. Be clever. Use his anger against him." Grandmother Desba also came to him, pressing something into his hand, a small medicine bundle made of leather and decorated with turquoise beads. "For protection," she said simply. "And to remind you that you fight not just for yourself but for Ayana and for peace between our peoples." Ayana herself remained quiet, but Jake could see the fear in her eyes. If he lost, she would be dishonored among her own people. If he won by killing Goyathle, he would make enemies of the warrior's friends and family. There seemed to be no good outcome. Chief Nalnish stood at the edge of the circle as the sun reached its peak. "Let this combat prove who speaks truth about bonds made in sacred water ceremony," he announced. "Let the spirits guide the worthy warrior to victory." Goyathle entered the circle first, moving with the fluid grace of a natural fighter. His scarred face showed no emotion, but his dark eyes burned with hatred. He carried his bow with casual confidence, and Jake noticed the knife at his belt had seen much use. Jake stepped into the circle, trying to calm his racing heart. The crowd fell silent except for the whisper of wind through the canyon. In that moment, he felt very alone and very far from anything he had ever known. The combat began with arrows. Goyathle immediately proved why he was considered one of the tribe's finest warriors, sending shaft after shaft whistling past Jake's head with deadly accuracy. Jake rolled and dodged, using rocks and brush for cover, but he could feel the warrior herding him like prey. When Jake tried to return fire, his arrows flew wide. The weeks of practice had improved his accuracy, but under pressure, facing a moving target who was trying to kill him, his skills deserted him. Goyathle's mocking laughter echoed off the canyon walls. Then Jake remembered Nayati's advice about fighting smart instead of strong. Instead of trying to match Goyathle's marksmanship, he began moving strategically, using the terrain to his advantage. He led the warrior toward a section of the circle where loose rocks made footing treacherous. Goyathle, focused on maintaining his arrow barrage, stepped carelessly on the unstable ground. His foot slipped, throwing off his aim, and Jake seized the opportunity. His arrow caught Goyathle in the shoulder, not a killing blow, but enough to draw blood and prove Jake wasn't helpless. The crowd murmured with surprise. Goyathle snarled in pain and fury, abandoning his bow and drawing his knife. Jake did the same, knowing the real fight was just beginning. The knife fight was brutal and exhausting. Goyathle was faster and more experienced, but Jake was younger and had the reach advantage. They circled each other like wolves looking for openings, lunging and retreating in deadly dance. Goyathle's superior skill began to tell. He opened cuts on Jake's arm and leg, and Jake could feel his strength starting to ebb. The warrior pressed his attack, driving Jake backward toward the edge of the circle. But as Goyathle raised his knife for what looked like a finishing blow, Jake did something unexpected. Instead of retreating further, he stepped inside the warrior's guard and grabbed Goyathle's knife hand. Wrestling for control of the weapon, they went down together in a tangle of limbs, rolling in the dust as each tried to gain advantage. Jake was losing the struggle when he remembered something grandmother Desba had taught him, that Apache fighting wasn't just about physical strength, but about spiritual power and the will to survive. Drawing on reserves he didn't know he had, Jake managed to twist Goyathle's arm, forcing the warrior to drop his knife. Before Goyathle could recover, Jake had his own blade pressed to the man's throat. The canyon fell completely silent. Jake could feel the warrior's pulse racing beneath his blade, see the surprise in his enemy's eyes. One small movement would end the fight permanently. But as Jake looked down at Goyathle, he realized that killing him would solve nothing. It would only create new hatred, new cycles of revenge. Instead, he did something that shocked everyone present. He pulled the knife back and offered Goyathle his hand to help him up. "The fight is over," Jake said in his halting Apache, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "You fought with honor. I claim no victory that dishonors a brave warrior." Goyathle stared at him in amazement, then at the offered hand. For a long moment, the outcome hung in balance. Then slowly, the scarred warrior accepted Jake's help and stood. The crowd erupted in surprised chatter, but Chief Nalnish raised his hand for silence. "The spirits have spoken," he declared. "Combat is finished. White man has proven he can fight like Apache warrior and more. He has shown mercy that honors our values. No one may question his place among us again." As Jake walked out of the circle, Ayanna ran to him, tears streaming down her face. "You could have killed him," she whispered. "Why did you not?" Jake looked back at Goyathle, who was being tended by his friends but watching Jake with new respect in his eyes. "Because I'm trying to become Apache," he said simply. "And Apache way is not just about being strong enough to win, but wise enough to know when winning isn't what matters most." The night of the full moon arrived with a clarity that seemed to illuminate more than just the desert landscape. The entire village had gathered for the Feast of Changing Seasons, but everyone knew this celebration would also mark the final decision about Jake's place among the Apache people. Over the past week since the combat with Goyathle, Jake had noticed subtle changes in how the villagers treated him. Warriors who had previously ignored him now nodded respectfully when they passed. Children who had once stared with fearful curiosity now approached him with shy smiles. Even Goyathle himself had surprised Jake by offering a gruff greeting that morning, along with advice about improving his knife-fighting stance. The feast began at sunset with traditional foods prepared by the women of the tribe. Jake sat with Ayanna and her family, but he could feel the weight of everyone's attention. Tonight, Chief Nalnish and the Council of Elders would announce their decision about whether he had truly proven himself worthy of becoming Apache. As the meal concluded, the chief stood and called for silence. The flickering firelight cast dancing shadows on his weathered face as he began to speak. "3 moons ago, a stranger came among us," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "He came not as conqueror or enemy, but as one who showed mercy to our daughter when she lay dying. By our laws, this act bound him to us and us to him." Jake felt Ayanna's hand slip into his, offering silent support. "Since that day, we have watched this man called Jake," the chief continued. "We have tested his courage, his determination, his willingness to learn our ways. Some among us thought it impossible for a white man to become truly Apache. Others believed the spirits had guided his steps for a purpose." Chief Nalnish paused, his gaze sweeping across the gathered crowd before settling on Jake. "The council has reached its decision." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Jake could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. "Jake has shown us that a man's worth is not determined by the color of his skin or the place of his birth, but by the contents of his heart," the chief declared. "He has learned our language, honored our customs, and proven his courage in combat. Most importantly, he has shown wisdom and mercy that honors the Apache way." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd, but the chief wasn't finished. Therefore, By the authority of the tribal council and the blessing of our ancestors, we formally accept Jake into our people. He shall be known by the Apache name Bidziel, one who is strong in spirit. He has earned the right to call himself Apache, and we are proud to call him brother." The canyon erupted in cheers and celebration. Warriors who had once viewed Jake with suspicion now stepped forward to embrace him and offer their congratulations. Grandmother Desba wept openly, pulling Jake into a fierce hug and whispering Apache blessings in his ear. But the greatest joy came from seeing Ayana's radiant smile. For the first time since he had brought her home, she looked completely happy and at peace. The weight of shame and uncertainty that had burdened her was finally lifted. As the celebration continued around them, Chief Nalnish approached Jake privately. "There is one more matter to address," he said quietly. "The marriage bond created by the water ritual was emergency law, necessary to protect Ayana's honor and give you time to prove yourself. Now that you are truly Apache, you and my granddaughter must choose your path freely." Jake looked at the chief in surprise. "You mean we don't have to stay married?" "The spirits brought you together, but they do not force love where none exists," Chief Nalnish replied wisely. "You have both honored your obligations. If you wish to part as friends, the tribe will understand. If you choose to stay together, it must be because your hearts desire it, not because law demands it." Jake turned to find Ayana listening nearby, her expression unreadable in the firelight. "What do you want?" he asked her softly. She was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. "When I first spoke the words that made you my husband, it was from duty and desperation," she said finally. "I needed protection, and you needed time to prove yourself to my people. But these past weeks—" "Yes?" Jake prompted when she hesitated. "I have watched you struggle to learn our ways, not because you had to, but because you wanted to understand and respect them. I have seen you show kindness to children, patience with elders, and mercy even to enemies. I have seen the man you truly are." She paused, then smiled. "The marriage began from law, but it has grown into something real." Jake felt his heart swell as he realized he felt the same way. Somewhere between learning to track deer and memorizing Apache words for different types of clouds, he had fallen in love with this remarkable woman. More than that, he had fallen in love with the entire Apache way of life. The connection to nature, the emphasis on community, the spiritual richness that had been missing from his old existence. "Then let's make it official," he said, taking both her hands in his. "Not because Apache law says we have to, but because I want to spend my life with you." The formal marriage ceremony took place 3 days later, incorporating both traditional Apache rituals and personal touches that reflected their unique story. Jake wore buckskin clothes decorated with symbols that told the story of his journey from stranger to tribal member. Ayana wore a dress of soft white deerskin adorned with turquoise beads, her long black hair braided with eagle feathers. The entire village participated in the celebration, which lasted from sunrise to sunset. Even Goyathle attended, bringing a fine hunting bow as a wedding gift and formally welcoming Jake into the warrior brotherhood. As the evening wound down and the newlyweds prepared to retire to their own wickiup, a wedding gift from the tribe, Jake reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. 3 months ago, he had been a drifting cowboy with no ties to anyone or anything. Now he was a married man with a family, a community, and a purpose. "Do you ever regret giving me that water?" Ayana asked as they stood outside their new home, looking up at the star-filled sky. Jake considered the question seriously. He thought about the freedom he had given up, the dangers he had faced, the complete transformation of his identity. Then he looked at his wife's face in the moonlight and thought about the richness that had come into his life. "Never," he said firmly. "Best decision I ever made, even if I didn't know I was making it at the time." Ayana smiled and leaned against his shoulder. "The spirits work in mysterious ways," she said softly. "Perhaps they knew we needed each other before we knew it ourselves." As they entered their home together, Jake marveled at how a simple act of kindness, offering water to someone in need, had led to such profound changes. He had learned that sometimes the most important moments in life come disguised as ordinary choices, and that showing mercy to others often brings unexpected blessings to ourselves. In the distance, a coyote howled at the moon, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl called back, the eternal conversation between the creatures of the desert continuing as it had for countless generations. Jake smiled, knowing he was now part of that ancient dialogue. Bound by love and choice to this land, these people, and this extraordinary woman who had changed his life simply by accepting a drink of water when she needed it most.